Sly 3 Honor Among Thieves. This game recently passed its 14th release anniversary, and it's always had a special place in my heart, having been my favorite Sly Cooper game ever since I got my hands on it. It's got a solid story, a diverse cast of playable characters, and some awesome gameplay, such as the charge combos, the grapple cam, and the bouncy ball. But today, I'm not here to tell you why I like this game. Instead, well, let me just show you. Before we get into all of that madness, let's start with a brief introduction. Sly 3 Honor Among Thieves was developed by Sucker Punch Productions and was published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. It was released exclusively for the PlayStation 2 on September 26, 2005, at least in the United States. However, the dates that I want to bring attention to in this video are the final, or Gold Master, build dates. These dates represent when the final game was finally finished and was ready for production. A Gold Master indicates that this build will be the build that will be used for production. In Sly 3's case, the North American Gold Master is dated August 28, 2005, while the PAL Gold Master is dated September 22, 2005. However, as some of you may know, over the past year, certain prototype builds of Sly 3 have emerged. These builds were in progress, incomplete, and often buggy builds that were meant for internal development and were not intended for public use. But, of course, they made their way onto the internet. And, well, with such great builds came great responsibility. Anyways, the whole point of this video today is to showcase and guide you through the flagship feature that was found in those prototype builds, their debug menus. Before we begin, what exactly is a debug menu? Well, it's a user interface in some sort of program, in this case a video game, that allows the player to access hidden content, unused content, and areas that are normally used for testing or debugging purposes, hence the name debug menu. It's not normally accessible during normal gameplay, and it's mainly used for testing purposes, as I mentioned before. This menu differs from a debug mode, which you may know exists from the Jak and Daxter games. A debug mode allows you to control the character in real time while accessing debugging functions, whereas the debug menu pauses the game and allows you to access the debug functions, but it doesn't let you access them in real time, so it's sort of, you're playing cause and effect essentially with a debug menu, whereas with the debug mode, you're able to see your changes in real time. As of the recording in this video, the debug menu that I'll be showing in this video doesn't actually let you access a debug mode, at least not natively. With the introduction out of the way, what will you need to be able to mess around with this debug menu? First of all, you'll need PCSX2, the leading PlayStation 2 emulator. Unless you have a modded PlayStation 2, this will be the only way you'll be able to access the particular Sly 3 build that we'll be using and its menu properly. As of the recording of this video, you'll want to avoid getting PCSX2 version 1.4.0, as it's not updated to where the specific Sly 3 build and the debug menu is usable. Instead, you'll want to navigate to the daily development builds and download any of the builds listed on that page. Don't worry, just because they're not quote-unquote stable doesn't mean that they won't work. They will certainly work well with what we're trying to do today. Please note that from this point on, I'll assume that you've got PCSX2 set up and working properly. This isn't a PCSX2 guide video, so if you are having trouble setting up PCSX2, I highly suggest looking at some tutorials on YouTube. There are plenty of them out there. I'll assume from this point on that PCSX2 is set up to the way you want it and that the Sly 3 game is playable. Speaking of the Sly 3 game, the second step is obtaining it. Now, this isn't your normal run-of-the-mill Sly 3 game that you may already have a disc of, or maybe you've already played it on PS3 or whatever. It's not that particular game. It's actually a very specific build that was uncovered about a year ago and was dumped, and that's the particular build you'll need, because that's one of the two builds right now that the debug menu is actually accessible in, you can't access it in the final game. I won't be sharing the link to where you can get that build just because it is an ISO, but if you do some Google foo, you'll be able to find it pretty easily, and you'll be able to download it and easily load it up. In this video, I'll be focusing primarily on the August build, though the setup and overall layout of the debug menu and the functions that you'll find throughout the menu are pretty similar between both prototype builds. Some do vary from one another. It's the September build, especially because it is so close to when Sly 3 finally released. It's a little more finalized and there are some functions added in, whereas the August build may not have all of its functions fully finalized. Lastly, in order to access the debug menu in an easy manner, you'll need either of the files linked in the description down below. One is a PNACH file, or essentially PCSX2 cheat file that you can place in your PCSX2 cheats folder. This will allow essentially a button combination that will allow you to access the debug menu during gameplay. This file was created by Mios, who also discovered the existence of the menu in the first place, and he also has a video going over that menu, which I highly suggest watching. There'll be a link to that in the description down below, and he basically goes over a little bit of the functions as well, so definitely give that a watch. The other option, if you don't want to download the cheat file, is downloading an executable trainer, which is what I'll be using in this video. This trainer was developed by I'm Just a Tester, another prototype explorer who has some really intriguing content on his channel that goes well beyond Sly. He does a lot of Ratchet and Jack content as well. There'll be a download link to this trainer in the description down below, as well as Tester's channel if you want to check it out. As this trainer is an executable file, it will get flagged by your antivirus, but rest assured it's harmless. Using this trainer is pretty simple in nature. All you do is check the box and follow the instructions on the trainer, and you'll be accessing the debug menu in no time. Before we finally get into the debug menu contents, I do have to give a few shoutouts. First of all, while I've explored most of the functions of each item within this debug menu, I was definitely not the one who discovered it in the first place. All of that credit goes to Mios, who I mentioned earlier. He was the one who discovered how to access it and where it was, and he shared this method out, so huge props to him. Definitely go give his channel a watch if you haven't already. Even before then, this would not have been possible without this particular build of Sly 3 in the first place, the August build. This was obtained and shared by Goo, who you might already know does a lot of wacky Sly Cooper content, especially with these prototype builds. If you don't know his channel, definitely give him a watch as well. He makes some pretty wacky content and some pretty neat mods for these Sly Cooper games. Lastly, I do want to thank Mios again, as well as Tester, for making their efforts in making the debug menu easily accessible for everyone. Rather than having to go through something like Cheat Engine and find the memory addresses, either this cheat folder or this executable file makes it super easy to access, and it makes it really fun to play around with for the everyday person. So huge thanks to those two for making it so easy to access, and yeah, that's about it. The one last thing, if you are interested in reading about this instead of watching this video, which may or may not be really long, I'm not quite sure, I've documented most of this, if not all of what I'm about to talk about, in the newly announced Sly Cooper Technical Wiki, and so that'll be in the description down below if you are interested in reading rather than watching. With that all said, let's get started into the debug menu. So once you've got the game booted up and ready to go, you can either choose to watch this intro in its entirety, or you can choose to skip it by pushing the start button. I'll push the start button and it'll bring up the language menu. It says Sly 2 Band of Thieves, but don't worry, this is a Sly 3 build. Just, I guess just a feature that carried over from Sly 2. You have various language options to pick from. I'll actually push triangle to exit out, just to give you an idea of what the game looks like if you haven't picked a language. So I'll pick English, and then it'll basically put me in the start screen, the English start screen. So I'll just push start for the new game, and I'll skip the memory card. And so what we have here is the intro cinematic. Now you can actually skip the dialogue by pushing L1, and it'll skip through most of the dialogue just fine. And L1 also works for skipping cutscenes, other dialogue options, that sort of thing. So if you want to skip like a chalk talk, let's say, then you can just push L1 and it'll skip it. One thing before I do access the debug menu is you might notice in the bottom right I have which buttons I'm pushing down. And I'll have that zoomed out in the bottom right of the video just in case you're interested in seeing what buttons I'm pushing. Okay, so to access the debug menu itself, you just push the start button and then push X on keep playing. And you're in the debug menu. And you'll notice as you scroll down using either the up and down buttons on the D-pad or the left analog stick up and down, there's quite a few options to pick from. There's a lot of stuff you can do in the debug menu, and it's a little overwhelming at first. However, just to save you all of that, I'll actually just go to the bottom of the debug menu, and you'll notice that these, anytime you see these ellipses, they're just leading to another sub-menu. And really all we'll care about are these 6 sub-menus here: reset, load, camera, warps, character, display. These 6 menus have all of these other functions up here within at least one of those menus. So instead of having to scroll through whichever option you're looking for, you can just access the debug menu, hit the up arrow to be at the bottom of the menu, and voila, you have easy access to the functions that you're interested in. I'll try to go through these systematically just to sort of have them make sense. I'll start off with reset. So if you hit X on reset, you're greeted with a few options here. And also, just a side note, if you want to get out of the menu, just push triangle and you're out of the menu. And if you want to get out of the debug menu, just push triangle again. So I'll launch the debug menu again. So going to reset, this is essentially all the job specific functions that you have access to. So reset mission pops up when you're in a mission, and that basically, well, resets the mission that you're currently in. So I'm in the prologue right now, so lets me reset that prologue if I'd like. Reset to checkpoint shows you all the checkpoints of all the jobs in the current episode that you're in. So I'm currently in technically episode 6, the Cooper Vault episode, so I have access to not only all the prologue checkpoints, but also all the checkpoints that show up in the last episode. Such as when you're the guru and trying to lure all the sharks, when you're Carmelita and fighting the boss to free Sly, when you're Dimitri and diving, etc., etc. So I have access to all of these checkpoints, and pushing X allows you to go to that specific checkpoint if you'd like. Reset to checkpoint and zero focus is very similar to the normal reset to checkpoint. However, that zero focus essentially means any sort of dialogue or cutscenes or cinematics that may play just before a job, more specifically dialogue that may play when you reach a checkpoint, that replays when you reset to checkpoint with zero focus. Zero focus is essentially saying you're going into this checkpoint for the very first time, and so any sort of dialogue that might play at the beginning of that checkpoint will play when you reset via this option. It will not be the case when you reset without zero focus. So that's essentially what zero focus means there. Reset via Wayback Machine is similar to the other reset options. However, this menu consists of the beginning of the jobs as well as their Master Thief challenges if they exist. So for instance, you have the main jobs of episode 6, Free Sly's Carmelita freeing Sly, the Sharks is the Guru convincing the Sharks, Dive is Dimitri's mission, etc. And then you also have some Master Thief challenges such as the Gauntlet Timed, which is essentially you going through the Cooper Vault in a timed fashion. These bounce missions that were cut from the final game, these are essentially bounce challenges for Murray that he can do in the episode 6 hub world. And then you've got your boss timed, which is the final boss timed, as you might have guessed. So that's what the Wayback Machine is. It's very similar to these other two options, but it does allow you to go to the beginning of the job or alternatively access the Master Thief challenges. Continue lineup is a little more glitchy. It technically just goes to the next job or it finishes the job that you're currently in. It gets a little more messy to use this function in parts of the game that aren't nearly as finished, such as episodes 5 and 6. This function does get a little weird, and using it in episode 6 especially kind of confuses the game a little bit. It doesn't really know what to do, so despite the job finishing, you're still in the same location that you currently were when the job was occurring. So I would say use this function with caution, or use it however you want. It's honestly pretty fun to experiment with this. Reload allows you to access some different screens here. So reload to checkpoint, zero focus, and wayback machine are also in this menu. Normal screen is the screen that we're looking at right now. And this makes more sense when you look at multiplayer screen and 3D screen. So multiplayer screen is the 2-player mode essentially, but this tends to not work as well as you might think. And I'll show how you can actually get into 2-player mode a little later on. Alright, so we're back to a playable state. So if I go to reset, and I go to reload, let's try that multiplayer screen this time. So hopefully that'll do something. Oh boy.
Remember to place the dynamite with the circle button near the anchor, or it'll blow a hole in
well, that's
your back.
cool. The game froze. Well then. 3D screen is, as you might expect, it reloads the game with 3D screen, so I can actually do that really quick, and you'll see that it's in that 3D mode where you can use your 3D glasses. And yeah, I probably should have mentioned, so reloading in episode 6 has a lot of weird things that happen. As you might have seen there, I didn't reload where I was previously. I reloaded in a different location in episode 6, and I just basically fell into the water and died. But now I'm back in the right place. So yeah, this is 3D mode. I'll actually get out of 3D mode because it tends to tank my frame rate. So if we go back to reset, or reload, and then reload with normal screen, I should get back to the normal screen that we all like to play, and yeah, I fell again. So we'll let the game reload properly, hopefully. Okay, so now we go back to reload. These other screens here, reload with language, as you might have guessed. You can reload with a different language if you'd like, rather than English, which I'm currently in. And then reload with cleared game state is a little interesting. It essentially, it's a little weird, and it depends on which episode you're in. So for instance, I guess this is a pretty good way to look at it, because so I reloaded while I was in episode 6, when I was in the Cane Island level. But if you're in, say, like Venice, episode 1, or if you're in episode 2, any episode essentially, what that reload function will do is it will reset your episode progress to 0, and then put you back into the episode menu, which is a little interesting. And additionally, if you, let's say you have beaten the game, so you have all 6 episodes unlocked, but you reset your progress on episode 1 using the reload function here, reload with cleared game state. If you use that on episode 1, then you won't have access to the episodes after episode 1, and your progress on episode 1 will be 0%. So this is a little more finicky, and it does have different outcomes depending on where you use that function. The other thing with reset, and I can actually do that by going back to, maybe not. So actually what we'll do here is we'll load up the DVD menu. There's just one more thing I want to show with reset, and these options only show up when you're in the episode menu. So reset world is something that you don't see. This also doesn't work as you might think. Intuitively, you might think it would reset your episode progress, but it doesn't seem to do that. It's a little more nuanced, and I haven't really figured that out quite yet. Reset via Wayback Machine we've already explored, and then reload again gives you those reload states if you like. Moving on to load. Load is the menu that you'll probably have a lot more fun with because it essentially gives you access to all of the areas in all the episodes of the game. And so they're organized essentially by location. So DVD menu is the episode menu, as you might expect. iTrainer is the hazard room. And then all the V's here. The V stands for Venice. So these are all the locations that you can explore in that first episode, which takes place in Venice. EXT in general stands for exterior, so that's the main hub world. So VEXT, OEXT, HEXT, etc. Those are all the hub worlds of those respective areas. And then anything that's not EXT is sublocation in that episode. So O stands for Outback, so you have all these Outback locations here. H stands for Holland, so episode 3, Flight of Fancy, takes place in all of these locations. C stands for China, so you have all of these China levels. P stands for Pirate, so you have all of these Pirate levels. And then M stands for Dr. M, so all of the Cooper Vault sublocations are listed here. And accessing them gets you essentially into that location. So as an example, we can load into VEXT. And loading into this for the very first time, we'll play that sort of intro episode cinematic that, at least in the final game, shows Sly and Bentley traveling to the safe house. I'll actually push start to get past that. Then I'll push X to be Sly, and I'm in the hub world. So you can essentially do that with any location, and you'll load in to that location generally with the character that you're currently controlling. Otherwise, it'll usually default to Sly. So some instances where this might not go as expected, let's go to Canal actually. Canal's an interesting one, and you'll probably recognize what it is. So for those of you who've played Sly 3 a little bit, you'll recognize that this is actually the level from Canal Chase. So that's when Sly and Bentley are trying to take down the boats, and they also take down Octavio in the operation. This is the level they do it in, and you're able to traverse the Sly on foot around the locations. Now, obviously these buildings aren't rendered or anything. They really didn't have a reason to be rendered, but it's certainly cool to see nonetheless. There is an edge, and if you fall off the edge, well, it's basically instant death. So it definitely has its limits, but it's still pretty cool to explore this location. We can also try loading to the apartments here. The apartments are just the coffee houses that you and Sly and Bentley go into, and Bentley solves those picture frame puzzles in each coffee shop. And so as you can see, you can sort of just explore them however. And there's actually some interesting things you can get from just sort of exploring these areas. So what I'll actually do really quick is I'll expand on what I'm doing here in a little bit, but I'm just going to unlock all the power-ups for Sly and assign Mega Jump to R2. So you'll notice that I'm already on top of one of the coffee houses, and that's actually another coffee house over there. Now, it's actually not traversable in normal ways, but there's certainly a way to get there. So I will actually just Mega Jump over, and as you can see, there's the other coffee shop behind. So all 3 coffee shops are actually just in one world, so to speak. And that's actually pretty apparent when you do the warp function, and it gives you a list of all the areas you can warp to. So you can see there's apartment 1, apartment 2, and apartment 3. So that's a brief intro to what the warp function does, and I'll expand upon that later when I do hit the warps menu. Other locations that are interesting in the load menu, obviously you can go and explore these for yourself, but there's definitely a few. The dogfight area is an interesting one here, because you're essentially loaded into the dogfight map, where all the dogfights take place in episode 3. And so it's actually kind of cool to explore this on foot. see a lot of things that you might not have seen while you were in a biplane. It's just kind of nice to explore the area. It is solid, as you might expect, though it is solid when you're also in the biplane, so it's not too surprising there. But yeah, that's one of the many locations you can load into. And if you want to load into, let's say, an area and just explore it a little more, this is the final boss arena, and so you can just look around. Dr. M isn't bugging you here. You can explore it as however you'd like, and there's not too much to worry about. So that's what the load function does. I've also documented all of this in the technical wiki. All of these locations are there, so if you are interested in reading up on what these locations are and what you can do in those locations, definitely read up on those if you're interested. Or, of course, try it for yourself. It's quite an experience just exploring all of these areas. Moving on to camera. So camera is interesting. I mean, most of the stuff, to be fair, is interesting, but camera is an interesting one just because of what you can do with the camera and how you can get some pretty neat screenshots. So you'll notice the default camera here is basically a default camera. It just puts the camera right behind Sly or whoever character you're controlling. But that's not what we're here for. So if we hit truck, pan, and orbit are essentially 3 different ways of manipulating the camera around where you are. So starting off with truck, what truck essentially allows you to do is it gives you a set of camera controls that you can use, but you can't control the character while you're manipulating the camera. So while you hit in truck mode, you can use the right analog stick, and that'll essentially move you around some focal point that you have. So moving it left and right moves it left and right around, up and down, rotates it up and down. Pretty straightforward there. L1 and L2 moves the camera vertically, so it allows you to move it up and down here, and then you can use the right analog stick to sort of rotate it around depending on where you are. R1 and R2 adjusts the FOV, so I'll actually use Sly here as an example. So if I do R1 and R2, I'm essentially adjusting the field of view around Sly. This is different than zoom in, zoom out, which is dictated by the up and down buttons on the D-pad. So this is actually zooming in, zooming out, whereas R1 and R2 control the field of view. So that's what the truck camera mode does. If I do, if I go back to default and then I'll go to pan. So pan has some different controls here. So the right analog stick left and right moves the camera as if it were on a slider, so it moves it horizontally left and right. The right analog stick up and down is responsible for your zooming in and out. L1, L2 moves the camera vertically up and down. And then the R1 and R2 buttons adjust the field of view like they did in the previous camera mode. And then the D-pad rotates the camera around some center point. So that's what the pan camera mode does. And then orbit has its own set of controls. So right analog stick here moves the camera around some focal point. It doesn't really do it here, and actually what I'll do is I will load back to the Venice exterior just to give you guys a better idea of how this specific camera mode functions, just because it is dependent on sort of where you are, like which world you're in. So using D-pad left and right, you can essentially switch camera modes around you. So I have a bunch of camera modes here that I'm just cycling through with the D-pad left and right. And then D-pad up and down zooms in and out from whichever camera mode I picked. So I'm going in and out here. The right analog stick rotates around whatever focal point I was picking there. And so I'm just zooming around and about. In this case, I think it seems to have chosen this coffee house, interestingly enough. So that's what the right analog stick here does. and then R1 and R2 adjusts the field of view. So hopefully there's some text on the side of this video just to show what those controls do, because it was a little confusing there. But essentially you can cycle through certain camera or certain focal points with the D-pad left and right, and then you can rotate around them with the right analog stick. So that's what this orbit camera does, which is quite interesting. The other camera modes are fairly self-explanatory. Toggle split screen splits it as if you were playing 2-player mode. I don't have a second controller in, nor is there a second character, so there's nothing going on in that second screen, but you can certainly play the game as if you were playing in 2-player mode. It's perfectly valid, but this is also tanking my frame rate, so I'm gonna get out of it. And I can do that with the default camera. Maybe not. We'll see. Nope, definitely not. Okay, well, we'll continue like this. So the rest of these options here just have 2 options: invert horizontal, invert vertical. So the free camera is the third-person camera that you're normally using at most parts of this game. Peak camera is the binocucom camera, so you can choose to invert that horizontally or vertically from the debug menu. The webcam camera is referring to the grapple cam, Bentley's gadget, so you can change whether you want that camera to be horizontal or vertical. The turret camera is the camera associated with any of the turret sections in this game. And then Carmelita aim camera is the strafe camera that Carmelita has at her disposal. So all of these can be adjusted to be either inverted or not inverted from the debug menu. Alternatively, you can just go to the start menu, and it should give you those options to switch up those cameras. So you can either do that through the start menu or through the debug menu. But compared to these other options, truck, pan, and orbit, these camera modes aren't really as exciting. Moving on to warps. So warps is another interesting feature here that I use constantly with load. So warps changes depending on which location you're in. But what warps are essentially the warp points that you can use to get they're like landmarks within the location that you're in. So I'm in the Venice exterior, so I have all of these warp points at my disposal, and going to any of those warp points allows you to, well, as you might guess, warp to that specific point. So the disguise start is the start of that guard duty job, where you dress up as the guards to fool them, and so that was disguise start here. If I go to say another option, like Rialto, I'm on top of the Rialto bridge. And so that's what warp does. This comes more in handy when you're in an internal location that you might not normally be able to access. So let's say I go to back to the coffee shops, for instance. And thankfully I'm not in 2-player mode anymore. If I go back and warp, so as I mentioned before, you can warp to any of the 3 coffee shops from this menu. So if I want to go into the big coffee shop, I just hit apartment 3 and I'm in. And I can also warp to the second one if I want to. And so as I mentioned before, those warp points differ depending on which location you're in. So let's just say we can go to the final boss arena. Then you can warp to the arena, which we're currently in, or you can warp to underneath the vehicle pits. So as you can see, I'm actually underneath the vehicle pits. And remember that these pop up at certain checkpoints in the Dr. M boss fight. So to see those as warp points is actually pretty interesting, and certainly gives you an insight of to how those checkpoints popped up within the boss fight. So going back to another area, there's quite a few warp points within each of these areas, and I'd highly suggest trying to look at them. Alternatively, they all are also documented on the wiki within each of these load pages. But let's say I go back to dogfight. So I'm on the main ground, but I can also warp to the boss wing. So recall that this is where Sly fought the Black Baron atop his plane. and that's a warp point within the dogfight location, which is pretty interesting to see. Obviously, there's nothing going on here right now, but certainly wasn't expecting that. If you hit, let's say I just do Mega Jump right there, then you can also get like a better idea of what is going on within this location that you aren't normally able to see within just this boss fight camera. Interestingly enough, though, you can't warp back to the ground while you're in this location. I'm not quite sure why. It obviously wasn't a defined location within the dogfight area. Other areas have their own interesting warp points. I'm trying to think. There might be a few that are there. There might not be. We can try going underwater. So this is the underwater portion in episode 6. Now, normally it does not treat you well at all, just because you're not really supposed to be there as Sly. And it just reset me back to the episode location. Oh, it actually reset me back to the first job. Makes sense, because I am in the same episode. The other thing I want to point out, actually, just as a tangent, is those debug menu outcomes differ depending on where you are at in the game. So for instance, I had actually completed this episode and had reloaded, or had loaded to the underwater portion of Sly, and I was actually able to mess around with it a little bit, and there should be a video popping up hopefully. But as you just noticed here, because I haven't completed the first job of this episode, the game respawned me back to the first job as opposed to back to the underwater section. So there's a lot of variables that come into play when you are exploring the debug menu, because, well, it can depend on which character you are, what your progress in the game is like, where you warp to, and who you warp to, and whether or not you're in a mission, whether you're just free roaming, etc., etc. There's a ton of outcomes that could occur, and they're all dependent on the state of your game save is, or what the state of your progress is. So I'd definitely recommend experimenting with it at different points in the game. Experiment with it while you're in a job, see what sort of outcomes occur. There's just a ton of possibilities here, and it's always just really cool to see what happens and what goes on. Anyways, we can go to the forest here. So I'll load to the forest, which is the boss fight of Sly versus General Tsao. And so as you can see, we're atop the first part. Unfortunately, we don't have Sly's magnificent powers, so he has to just manually jump and push the circle button as opposed to glide and push the circle button. The warp points here are the treetop cliff, which I was just there. The end of the stream is the end of the waterfall. However, the game doesn't really like you warping to anywhere below the treetop cliffs, so you can actually try that with the waterfall, and yeah, the game just doesn't like you warping to below the area for some reason. It's obviously very easy to do when you are actually in the job. The game is a little more lenient, but again, it really does depend on where you are at in the game. Another area I want to showcase with the load feature is the flashback. So the flashback in China is the arena where Sly faces off against Panda King when they're both meditating. So obviously there's no Panda King, but you can definitely go around the area and sort of see what's there and what's not there. And then if I try warping, I don't think there's a warp. So flashback arena is just the center of the arena. But that's the only warp point here. And that might actually lead me to character. So, because I do want to point out a character here. So after warps is the character menu. And there's a ton of options here. Some of them are self-explanatory, some of them aren't, so I'll try to go through them one by one. Set current character is just change your character to something else. This menu changes depending on which location you're in, because some locations can't accommodate all the characters. And then some of them oddly do, which is a little weird. So you might not have guessed that Bentley and Murray could have been playable in this location, but lo and behold, they certainly are. you can't really do anything, at least while the location is in this state. But in theory, if you wanted to, during the Sly versus Panda King boss fight, you could change your character out for Bentley and Murray, and you could see how the boss fight would go. So I'll actually set character with Murray, and he'll fall down, and voila, I am Murray. And then the other character here is the flashback, which is essentially that camera angle, it's essentially the character that the camera angle gets fixed to. So you might have noticed when you're playing through this boss fight that your camera is constantly fixed on the center. So I'm not moving my camera at all, I'm just moving the left analog stick and holding R1, and the camera is fixed to that quote-unquote character. I guess it's a clever way to make sure that your camera is fixed on something rather than allowing you to control it, but just figured I'd point that out. Setting current character with match is similar to setting current character, but with match means that that character will be in the exact same location that your current character is in. So I'll be Bentley, and I'm in the same place that I was as Sly. So if I set this as a flashback, flashback's an exception, but normally if I set it with Sly, for instance, then I'm in the center. This has its limitations and its oddities, as does a lot of things in this debug menu, but essentially these characters may or may not spawn correctly in some locations, and sometimes they will spawn exactly how you'd like them to. For instance, in some jobs where it is specifically limited to one character and the game gets really fussy about you using any other character, you could progress a certain amount of the job with that one character and then set current character with match to whatever other character you like, and it would work perfectly fine. So this definitely has some experimentation behind it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So it's definitely something that's not fixed, and it's not necessarily sequential either. So I'll actually load to an exterior location, because this gets you a better idea of what characters exist, and I'll actually load to China's exterior. Yeah, so I'll load to China's exterior here. And so if I just become Sly for the sake of getting out of the safe house, and I go and select whatever characters I want, I can choose Bentley, I can choose the RC car, which is normally in that location by the box that poisons Murray. Other characters include the Guru, so I can definitely be the Guru, though as you probably noticed there, he definitely does not spawn correctly, but if you respawn, then he will respawn just fine, and you can mess around with the Guru, see what he transforms into, etc, etc. You can become Carmelita, because as you know, she is roaming around the area, so she's definitely a character that could be used here. JT is Sly. That's one thing I forgot to mention. So in this debug menu, you might have also guessed that these characters aren't necessarily their exact names. The Shaman was the working name for the Guru for honestly the longest time in the Sly 3 marketing before it was changed over to the Guru. Carmelita, JT has been the name for Sly throughout the development of the Sly Cooper series, and it was one of the names proposed to be Sly's name before it was finalized to be Sly, but it is JT throughout these debug menus, which is kind of a nice throwback. Penelope is Penelope, Panda King is Panda King, Murray is Murray, and Safe House is the Safe House. The Safe House is a character, just loads you back into the Safe House location, the character selection screen, essentially. So it's not too exciting. But otherwise, if we were Penelope, for instance, we can definitely become Penelope. For some reason, she has a Murray icon. She can access the Safe House, which is kind of neat. She has that animation going for her. Additionally, she has a very limited move set. So if I go back to Penelope and actually go to maybe, I think it was options, and then Might not be options. Oh, it's controls, yeah. So Penelope doesn't have anything really there. She has the start menu, and that's about it. She doesn't have really any defined controls. She can definitely double jump. But that's really about it. Square, circle, triangle don't really do anything. Select doesn't do anything. She can run fast, so R1 definitely still works, but yeah, that's about it. Let's say we go and get detected by a guard. So she actually transforms into her sword fighting outfit from episode 5 when she faces off against Lafui, which is actually kind of interesting. Unfortunately, she still can't do anything. She can't attack. She can definitely double jump and run away, but she can't really do much else. So that's about as much as you can do with Penelope, unfortunately, but still cool to see her nonetheless as a playable character to some degree. I'll load to episode 6 as well, because there's some playable characters there that are worth mentioning. So, shoot, before Sly dies. So, cool, okay. Definitely don't want to be Bentley, so I can certainly be him if I wanted to. But it's honestly not why we're here right now. What we're gonna do is we're gonna reset my progress to we're gonna reset to the Carmelita boss, and I'll get back to you after I finish this job. Alright, so we're back. Episode 6 is technically complete now. So I'm spawning properly on top of the pirate ship like I should be. And I'm Sly. But we can also be different characters. So there's a lot of more characters here. Some you might recognize, some you might not. So Bentley, we recognize the biplane. You can actually become the biplane. Not too surprising considering you are the biplane when you fight Dr. M. But a cool party trick nonetheless. Other characters include the Panda King, because he is in this episode. The robot cars that Penelope fights in the RC tracks. It might actually be a better idea if we go through on solid ground and set them as match. So we can actually just mess around. There's 4 of them. As far as I could tell, they're not too different from one another, but still interesting nonetheless. We'll go back to here, set the current character as the 4th one. Yeah, so they're all pretty similar. They control a little more sensitively than you might expect. The left analog stick just causes them to turn instantly left. And I'm not even pushing that hard, but yeah, they're definitely much more sensitive than I thought they would be. If we go to their controls, if we can even go to their controls, let's see. They don't seem to have a controls thing going for them. Interesting. Well, that's what they look like. So those are those robot cars. And then the one car, so there's the RC car we all know and love. The one car that I skipped over deliberately that I'm going to access now is this van. So you might have remembered that the van was launched in episode 6 to get Bentley and Murray over to the Cooper Vault. And yeah, it's a playable character. Your camera angle is really weird because it treats it like an RC car. Axis to accelerate, left analog stick moves it around, square is to reverse, and yeah, it's basically a big RC car, in the shape of the Cooper van. Honestly, I was pretty surprised that it was a playable character here in the first place, but it's still interesting to see it nonetheless, and you know, I'm sure you can do some random shenanigans with it by, you know, warping to different locations, and just figuring out what you want to do with it. And you can also actually just use the camera view here, and just zoom around and, you know, get a better idea of what the Cooper van looks like. So that's what that looks like on the RC tracks. So definitely explore the character menus with every location you go to. Treat it like that one trophy from Sly 4. That's really annoying, because the characters here do differ from location to location, and their behavior also may not be the same in location to location. So definitely worth exploring those characters with every location that you go into. Moving on to suck, this one's also not as apparent as it might sound. When you hit the suck menu, you're greeted with numbers from 0 to 1 in increments of 0.1, and selecting them doesn't really make a difference, at least instantly. But with some experimentation and with some help from Brian Fleming, the founder of Sucker Punch Productions, he actually gave me a lot of insight onto what this menu does. Because, believe it or not, Sly 3 has a dynamic difficulty menu. As you progress through the game and as you may or may not die, or as you may do extremely well, this dynamic difficulty parameter alters itself to adjust for your performance. And essentially, these suck values indicate, how well the player is doing. So a 0 means that they're doing really well. 0.0 means that they're doing well, and the game may or may not throw, harder enemies at you, or you may or may not take more damage from certain enemies. Whereas a 1 means that you're not doing really well. You're sucking wind, as the expression goes. So the game will sort of change itself, so you'll take less damage from enemies, and so on and so forth. So you might have not actually noticed this. Anecdotally speaking, I've definitely seen this as I've played through Sly 2 and Sly 3, where that difficulty does adjust itself, so you take less damage than you might normally would from a guard or from a environment hazard, etc. So it's interesting to see that menu under character, but it's there nonetheless, and you can certainly alter that depending on what sort of challenge you like within the game. The rest of these functions are pretty self-explanatory, and I'll actually go back to being Sly just to better illustrate them, and also default my camera. So going back to the character menu, set 1 HP basically sets your health to 1. Sly normally has 40 hit points, so he now has 1 hit point. So any damage he'll take will kill him. So that's what the HP stands for, it's just your health. Max HP just sets your max back up, so you'll be down back up to 40. MP is your power-up meter, or your gadget meter. That sets it to 0. And then, as you might expect from the next function, max means it's back up to 100%. So nothing too surprising there. Kill just kills your current character. Not too special. It's there if you want to debug around with it, but, it's nothing too eventful. Toggle look at enemies is a little more nuanced as well. It essentially toggles whether or not Sly will look at enemies as he's roaming around through the hub worlds. This one's a little more difficult to display on video, but you do notice it when you are roaming around areas and Sly just sort of looks around at enemies that are nearby. Toggling this on and off definitely does make a little bit of a difference, though it is very subtle. Coins is its own menu within character, and it's pretty self-explanatory as well. You can set your coins to 0, set them to 10,000, add them, subtract them, etc. Setting coins to max sets your coins up to 999,999, and collecting any more coins doesn't make that number go up. So you could get more coins, but your number will never be more than 999,999. It'll always be that number. If I lose 10 coins, then it becomes that value. So essentially 1 million is your hard limit, at least for the coin counter. Buying items brings up ThiefNet. It's a little glitchy depending on where you are in the game. I've sort of haphazardly warped around to certain progression points within this game, which is why it's not working quite as well as you'd expect. But normally, if you're playing the game properly, like let's say I load to the Venice exterior, I load up as Sly, and then I go to buying items. So yeah, it still doesn't work nearly as well. This menu is a little more glitchy than you might expect. I can certainly access the gadget grid, I can access the pause menu, and all that stuff, but I really can't get out of this menu without loading to, say, like a different area. So use that menu with caution. Another menu you should use with caution, extreme caution actually, is the power-up chooser. Normally, this brings up the gadget grid for the character that you're currently in control with. However, using this function with characters that normally don't have a gadget grid, such as Carmelita, actually hard locks your game. Or soft locks your game. Honestly, I don't know the difference, but it freezes your game, and it doesn't allow you to pick any controls. It doesn't allow you to control the game. You can't access the debug menu again. You actually have to reload your game either from a previous save, a save slot, or just by rebooting the whole game. So definitely use this menu with caution because it can freeze up your game, and if you haven't been saving frequently, well, you'll have a lot of progress to make up. So use that one with caution. And before I accidentally lock myself into oblivion, I'll actually change back to Sly, go to the power up chooser. So yeah, that's what it normally does when you have a character that actually has a gadget grid. One thing I forgot to mention is the power-ups menu within the character menu. So if you go to the very bottom, you have the power-ups option, and this essentially lists all the power-ups that are available for the character that you're currently controlling. Now, this menu does change depending on which character you're controlling, as you might have guessed, and some of these power-ups aren't necessarily available in the gadget grid if the character has one. So if we revisit that power-up menu here, first of all, we have the basic two options that are available for almost all of the characters: acquire all and discard all. They do exactly what you think they would do. The rest of these are sort of internal names. Some you might recognize, some you might not. So Ninja Ball is Smoke Bomb, Dodge is the Combat Dodge, Rocket Boots is Rocket Boots, Paraglide is Paraglide, Quiet Kill is Silent Obliteration, Slow is Thief Reflexes, Long Jump is Feral Pounce, Mega Jump, Rush is actually not Time Rush like I initially thought, it's actually the Knockout Dive. So I've assigned it to L1 here, and you can actually see it in the power-up menu that it's assigned to Knockout Dive. So we'll go back into the power-ups menu here. And just continuing along the list, we have Invisibility, which is Shadow Power level 1. We have Full Invisibility, which is Shadow Power level 2. The Treasure Map, which is your Treasure Map power-up. And then we have the Shield, which is actually in the 2-player version of Sly 3. So you can access the shield power-up in single player, and it behaves exactly as it does in the 2-player mode. Just to demonstrate that, I'll max out my power-up meter here, and I will activate that power-up. So I'll just go to the shield and assign it to L1. And it's a shield. It's very short lasting. There's not much it's not active for long, but if I activate it, I basically don't take damage like a shield would do. So it does work properly, but it is super limited, and it consumes quite a bit of your power-up meter, in my opinion. Other power-ups that Sly can access are the ones you've seen before. The disguises are here, and the charge combos are here. So nothing too special with the power-up menu for Sly other than that shield power-up, as well as Shadow Power level 2, because I believe it is not accessible in the normal menu. Yes, I'm correct. So in the gadget grid for this build, you only have access to Shadow Power level 1. Shadow Power level 2 has to be accessed from the debug menu. So those are all of Sly's power-ups there. And we can swap out characters here just to show you what power-ups exist for each character. So we'll go to Bentley. Bentley, I have all of his power-ups as well. And if we go to the power-ups menu for Bentley, acquire all, discard all, are the same two options there. Remote Mine is your trigger bomb. The fishing is the fishing pole, the pickpocket pole. Alarm clock's your alarm clock. Nitro is your adrenaline burst that gives you a burst of speed. Guard Trap, I believe, is the health extractor that gives you health. Hover Pack is your hover pack. Insanity Strike is your crazy strike. The webcam bomb is your grapple cam bomb. So actually, let's just mess around with that for fun. So it is my grapple cam. Yep, it's the grapple cam. So just wanted to make sure that was clear. The scale strike, I believe, is the size destabilizer. The insanity bomb is the bomb that makes people go crazy, and the scale bomb is the bomb that shrinks people down to size. So nothing too surprising on Bentley's side. We'll set current character to the RC car. See if there's any power-ups there. So I just pushed X on the power-ups, and there aren't any power-ups to pick from. So there's no power-ups for the RC car. So we'll go to the shaman, and I believe there's also no power-ups here. Yeah, that's correct. And I believe also picking the power-up chooser will cause the game to hardlock. So just be careful. Again, if the character doesn't have a gadget grid and you pick the power-up chooser, it can go very wrong very fast. So just keep that in mind. Carmelita actually has some power-ups. I believe they're carryover from the 2-player mode. So you got Mega Jump, your Heat Seeker, your Teleport, and your Hypnotize. So just for kicks and giggles. Yeah, okay. Right. That's your Teleport right there. Let's try that again. That was kind of fun. So yeah, that's the Teleport. Wow. Alrighty. Let's Mega Jump. I've already used up my power-up meter, but Mega Jump is normally accessible with the circle button, so power-ups are the power-ups. Heat Seeker. I don't have max MP, so we'll set that up really quick. Yeah, there's the Heat Seeker right there. That's just doing its job. The last power-up here is Hypnotize, which its effect is probably more apparent in 2-player mode. Let's just say that. So, speaking of 2-player mode, I'm actually curious. I've never done this before, so this could go horribly wrong. But we will try reset, reload. Not necessarily with multiplayer screen, though we could certainly try that and see how broken it becomes.
Shield.
Well, I definitely have the shield active because it thinks I'm in 2-player mode, even though I'm not, so let's actually get out of there before things get too out of control. So if we go and toggle split screen, so there's that example there, and if I switch my character to Carmelita, and then I try using the power-up for Hypnotize, so we'll assign that. That's by default toggled to L1. I don't think it worked. At least I don't see anything in the 2-player screen right there. So it has its uses, I'm sure, in certain scenarios. Moving on to other characters that may or may not have power-ups. Penelope, I don't think she would have power-ups, and I also messed up the loading of her, but it's okay. That'll fix itself. So if we go to her power-ups here, yeah, she's got no power-ups, unsurprisingly. So Penelope doesn't have any. Panda King, I also think, does not have any. Yeah, he doesn't have any either. Murray obviously has some. So if we go to his power-ups here, we've got the ball, the bull rush, which is sort of his rush move, the shock throw, which is I believe, juggernaut throw, something like that. Scare attacks is his roar. Fire strike is when he has fire gloves. Flashbang. Fire flop is when he can. Oh yeah, fire flop is his thunder flop, but with fire waves, and then fire slam is when he throws enemies and there's a fire shockwave. So that's what happens there. And those are all of Murray's power-ups essentially. So that's about it with the characters. There is one character I'd like to showcase, and that's actually in episode 5. So if I load over to episode 5's main map, the at-sea map here, and I'll try to get myself into a ship battle. Hopefully I can actually do that. I can give you a better idea of what happens because, as it turns out, there might have been power-ups in a two-player ship battle mode that just never made it to the final game. So as you can see right now, I'm in full control of the ship here. I can turn as normal, but if I go to characters and I pick power-ups, so I actually have two menus here that I can pick from while I'm in the pirate ship mode. One is the Bud power-ups, and this is essentially the power-up list for the character that you're currently controlling on the ship. So in this case, these are all of Sly's power-ups, so those are all of the quote-unquote Bud power-ups available. The more interesting menu, however, is the sailboat power-ups. So the sailboat power-ups are power-ups that pertain to the actual ship itself. And all of these are pretty self-explanatory, but it's cool to see them implemented and in action. So for instance, just to give you a frame of reference, right? So this is my current turn speed here, which is, it's fine, it does the job. But if I go and enable turn speed again, I actually turn much faster than I normally would. And you'll probably remember that these power-ups just aren't normally available in the game, for whatever reason, the final game. So other power-ups on the ship include hull strength. So this is apparent when you take damage. You'll take damage at a lesser rate than you normally would. Health replenishes your health instantly. So I've lost some health right now, but I've regained some as well. So there's the health power-up there. Other power-ups include reload rate, so your cannons essentially become active faster than they normally would, and then your cannon range ensures that you can fire at longer distances, essentially. And these do work, and they do have tangible impacts pretty instantaneously. So it's cool to mess around with those and just see what each of those do. So just something I thought I'd figure out within the power-ups menu of the character section, because they do differ from character to character. Especially with some characters that you think might not have any power-ups or just don't control normally like the other characters, but turns out they may or may not have power-ups. Another set of power-ups appears when you are in control of the biplane. You can access those power-ups either by going into the two-player mode of biplane duel or by just going to a place where you can actually control the biplane. The easiest way to showcase that is by just loading into the dogfight level in Holland, and then you're given the option to change your character to the biplane. So I'll set my current character to just this first biplane here. Then I'll go to character, power-ups, and I have the power-ups that are normally available in the two-player mode, but are also available here if you would like to access them. They do what they normally do in the two-player mode. There's nothing special about them in single-player mode, but I figured it'd just be worth noting that they are available in here in case you do want to use them anytime during the single-player mode. Display is another interesting one here. The way display works, display is a little weird because it does require some of these functions to be active together. But if we enable performance display and disable memory remaining, then we don't see the memory remaining in the performance display. Pretty intuitive after you get that idea. GS memory remaining just shows the graphics memory remaining in that performance display, so I'll actually toggle that off. Tester display is what you're currently seeing on the bottom right. That's been active the whole time. It essentially shows you your location within the world, as well as how your analog sticks are moving, specifically the left analog stick. So what direction it's moving in, how far it's moving in, etc. That's what all of that's showing there. So nothing too intuitive there. And also, the other thing with the tester display, as you might have guessed, is it shows what buttons you're pushing. So there's that for you. Other parts of the display, the damage display is another interesting one. It shows essentially what damage is dealt to you and what damage that you deal. So I took 1 damage from that stone, and then I took 8 damage from that guard's attack. And remember that Sly has 40 hit points, so you can get an idea of how much damage the guard's doing to me right now. So there's that. And the damage display is pretty interesting to see. It can get a little weird when Carmelita's in the area, because then it shows what damage Carmelita is doing to the guards on your damage display. On one hand, it's a good indicator of knowing where Carmelita is, but on the other hand, it does screw up any sort of damage recordings you're trying to do if you are trying to get those recordings. Chase display is another interesting one. It actually gives you a pretty good insight into how the detection system in Sly 3 works. Because what essentially happens is when you're not in a fight or when you haven't been detected, it's blank. There's nothing going on. All is well, right? But there's certain stages of the chase display that show up. So let's say I go behind this guard and I whack him, right? Then I get out of his way. The damage display pops up. Or, sorry, not the damage. The chase display pops up. Now, what has happened here is I've created a reason for me to be detected, right? Which you saw from that create part. That means the guard doesn't see me, but he's alerted of my presence. So I can do that again. And now I'm detected, and so he sees me. He detects me. So that goes on for a while. If he lands an attack on me, or actually if I land an attack on him, then he goes into that attack mode. Actually, that didn't show it there at all. Jump up behind him. I'm detected. If I attack him, I do damage, and that's where that damage counter goes off. And then it changes back to detect when the guard sees me again. But while the guard is taking damage, that menu becomes active. And so essentially the first number, as you might have guessed, is how long your thief meter has been pulsing red. While the second number is showing you how long you've been in a certain phase of the detection. So they're taking damage for that long. I'm still currently being detected, but I'm no longer detected. The other part of that damage display, which I will show here really quick, is let's say I get a guard to know who I am, right? Then I'll start running away. Voila. So you might have noticed that there was that 5-second part there, right there, where the guard couldn't see me despite having detected me and my thief meter going off. That essentially meant that, yes, I was detected, but I was no longer within the guard's range of vision. So when I'm 5 seconds out of the guard's range of vision, I essentially go back to incognito mode. So that's what that damage display does, and it gives you some pretty good insight on how detection works in Sly 3. So that's honestly probably my most favorite menu to sort of keep track of, just because, you know, it gives you some interesting numbers that you can keep track of. Other parts of the display, you've got the audio display here, which, you know, has nice colors. I personally don't find this too useful, but it's there if you want it. Turbo buttons, normally what this does is it forces your buttons to push twice. So anytime you push a button, it interprets it as a 2x button press. So pushing X, for instance, makes you double jump, etc., etc. This actually makes it very difficult to access the debug menu, again, because it interprets your start button push as 2 start button pushes, which is pausing and unpausing the game. So I'd recommend to exert some caution when enabling the turbo buttons mode, just because it may or may not allow you to bring up the debug menu again. Hide flash is all of these, any of the graphic elements, essentially the HUD elements. The start menu here, I'm paused, but as you can see, the start menu isn't there, but I can certainly cycle through the start menu as if it were there. Similarly, your Binocucom doesn't exist, but you can certainly zoom in and out as if you had a Binocucom, and actually lets you get some cool pictures in the process if you're into that screenshot life. So that's what that looks like there. I'll actually enable that back. Actually, we can hide that back and just sort of give an idea of, let's say I go back to the episode menu. Yeah, you can't really see what's going on there, but if I re-enable Flash, voila, you can see what's going on. So that's what Flash does, essentially. Force 3D on all world loads is probably the most self-explanatory function in this whole menu. It forces 3D mode on any worlds that you load from this point on. So if I enable it and I load in, let's just load back into Venice, I'm in 3D mode. Not too surprising there, but it's certainly there if you need it. As I mentioned earlier, it tanks my frame rate, so I'm gonna get out of this as soon as I can. It's in the, might be in reset. Yeah, it's in reset reload with normal screen. So there's that. Hopefully. Oh no, it didn't work. Of course. The reason why that didn't work, and if you haven't figured it out yet, is because this Force 3 thing is a toggle. So as long as it's toggled on, any world loads will load in 3D. So I'll toggle that off, and I'll try reloading Venice again. With the reload, and then I go back to normal screen. And yeah, it'll work. So just some things to keep in mind. Display, and then play movies is just the folder of all the movies that are in this game. If you've seen my comparison series, then you'll know that some of these quote-unquote exist, but they're just placeholders. This was a bad example because it does exist. So if we load into the episode 6 movies, then we'll see that it's a placeholder. Yeah, so you can certainly use this menu to access the cutscenes if you'd like, or any of the Chalk Talks. But you know, it's just an option. Other movies are sort of the credits, which is a placeholder. And then I believe these two exist. The action trailer and the attract exist, like they're actual movies that you can watch, which is it's pretty neat to see this included in the game. I believe these were used for marketing the game, but they also exist within the game. So there's those movies, and you can watch those at your leisure as well. The last thing I want to bring attention to that isn't in these 6 menus here is a speed multiplier that can alter the speed of the game. For some reason, these options here aren't available in the game, and the way you navigate to it is really simple. You just load up the debug menu as usual, and then you just scroll down a little bit until you hit 0x, 150x, 1/10x, 1/5x, 1/2x, 1x, 1.5x, and 2x, as well as 5x. And these are just parameters that control how fast the game goes. So currently we're at 1x, so we can just see how that's going. If I go and change this to 2x, then it'll go faster. As you can see there, it's pretty fast, and I'm not really doing too much. 5x is where things go crazy, and I strongly recommend you use this option with caution because things get really messy really fast. And keep in mind that the 5x toggle, any of these toggles, actually controls how fast you go in this debug menu as well. So sometimes you might not be able to access certain parts of the debug menu with proper precision if you're at 5x. So just use that with caution. So I'll switch that back to 1x. Alternatively, you can also slow it down, so you can use 1/2x, 1/5x, 1/10x, or even 150x. I don't recommend 1/10 or 150 unless you're super patient, and I especially seriously don't recommend 0x because your game is frozen essentially. There's no way getting back into it without reloading your save or restarting the game completely. So don't use 0x. These ones use if you have patience, and then the other ones, use at your own convenience. So with that said, that really closes out the debug menu's main functions. Lastly, I do want to touch on some random things that don't necessarily fit into any of these menus, but are certainly worth noting if you're just interested in what this build has that wasn't already covered in my comparison series. And that being some of the power-ups. So as you might have noticed from some of my previous videos, some of these power-ups aren't completely limited. For one thing, a good example is Mega Jump actually existing. So Mega Jump, it does exist in this game with unlimited uses. So it doesn't consume any of the power-up meter, which is very convenient, and can allow you to travel to really high points in the map. Obviously, Sly 3 is a little more strict with its death boxes. There's a skybox of death, and there's also these outside boxes of death. So if you try to traverse to that area over there, you'll definitely hit a wall of death. But obviously, you can use the Mega Jump power up to get around to areas that you might not normally have been able to get to. You can also use it while you're perched using the circle button. So I can get through up here, mega jump up there, and then I can climb the steeple, which normally you cannot access in the final game just because you don't have mega jump. So there's one area you can explore. If I spire jump and time mega jump properly, then there's that. Additionally, you can also use some power-ups in the air that you might not normally be able to. So I'll assign knockout dive to L1 and rocket boots to L2. So let's say I do mega jump off, and I can go around using rocket boots in the air, which is honestly a much quicker traversal method than the paraglider. It gets you farther while also not using as much, or it gets you farther while also not decreasing your elevation as much, which is very convenient. And then you can also explore these areas, which again are not normally accessible, but they just have spire jumps on them, which is quite convenient actually. I believe, so if I do rocket boots again, yes, you can definitely spam knockout dive, surprisingly. I used up most of my power up meter there, but of course with the debug menu, set it to max, and then just spam it over and over again, and I can do it in the air, which is pretty hilarious. So a good example here is if I just max it out again, voila! So yeah, you can use knockout dive in the air, which is pretty funny. You can spam it. If I recall correctly, actually, if I set it to max and actually use it properly on an enemy, no, so it doesn't target as well as I thought it would. But yeah, it's certainly there. It certainly has its uses. Another part that I want to point out is in episode 5. So I'll actually load to the pirate menu at sea. So that's the ship's safe house, and I'll just go back a Sly here. So during the pirate battle, if we want, we could probably switch characters on the fly here. So we can definitely be Panda King if we'd like, and just see how that fares. They definitely take some damage, as you might expect. Quite satisfyingly, if I may add. And yeah, there's that animation that's supposed to play when Sly gets loot. Speaking of locking the game, I just did that myself. Very conveniently, this is essentially what the game looks like when it doesn't really know what to do. So pushing the start menu doesn't do anything. You can definitely see my button pushes being registered, but they have no actions associated with them, so I don't really have a choice but to reload back to a save state that I had already defined here. So just goes to show you that, you know, some things definitely might not happen as you think they would, and there's just a lot of ways to mess around with this menu. Another outcome I just want to show, just for kicks and giggles, is if I load into one of the treasure temples, I think it might be this one. It's not this one, it's Hall B. So I wanted to load into General Tsao's palace. So if I go to load and I load into Hall B, that should be the right one. Yeah, okay. So if I go into warp, there's no warp positions available. But if I go into, let's say, a job, so let's say I go into reset to checkpoint, and I want to reset to when General Tsao steals the computer. So I go into the hall intro.
General Tsao's computer has to be
So I'm Bentley right now, as the job would dictate, but let's say I go to warp. So there's no warp here. Characters, I could probably change my character to be anything. If I change it to be the hack ship, I am the hack ship, which, as you might guess, you know, pretty self-explanatory there. But I could probably change my character in the same location as the hack ship to the shaman, I guess, is what I picked. But I'm the shaman in the hacking area, which is pretty cool. Similarly, if I change to Sly, I'm still in the hacking area, but I'm Sly this time, which is pretty neat. And you normally wouldn't be able to access this thing unless you're in the specific job. So it just goes to show, you know, it really depends on what the state of your game is while you use these debug functions. Let's say I go in and reset to the hacking part of this mission. So the checkpoint just directly after here. Hack. So I'm in the hacking portion with all the enemies, and if I go in and change my character to one of the characters here, I'm taking damage as if the hazards are there, as if I'm running into those hazards, which you saw right there because I took a damage from that enemy. And I'll continue to take damage as long as I'm interacting with those enemies. So it's obviously really cool to see sort of the areas that you can access as characters that you might not normally be able to be. Another part may or may not be, let's see here. There might be, we could probably just go into the treetop intro actually. Oh yeah, 3D mode's enabled here. This might actually be a little problematic just because it'll probably force the cutscene to play. But we shall see. So currently in the boss fight, and you know, I can mess around with the characters as always. If I want to warp to, let's say, the treetop cliff here, I can certainly do that as Bentley, and he will let me do that, which is kind of funny. Let's see actually if I can nail Sal with the sleep dart. Will that work? I don't know if I can get that range, but oh, it worked. It worked. Where'd he go? Oh, he fell. It's hilarious. But yeah, no, I was surprised that worked. Wow. Let's see here. Let's keep going. Yeah, it works. That's hilarious. If I go in as Sly, let's say, set character as Sly. Oh boy, I don't know what I did there. Oh wow, okay, that's really janky. Can I not warp to the treetop cliff? I can, but I think it won't let me. Ah, interesting. So yes, pushing the X button acts as if I am gliding. Which I was not expecting. I was expecting it to work like the normal X button, but it doesn't. Interestingly enough, however, Sao is targeting me as normal, which is it's kind of cool. Anyways, before I get too sidetracked, I'll leave you guys to mess around with this menu and sort of discover what's there, what you can do, what all the possibilities are. As I've been mentioning throughout this video, it really depends on where your game is at, what you're doing at your current position in the game, and what you're trying to do with this menu, because there's so many outcomes and so many possibilities, and they all depend on what you've been doing up until that point, which can kind of be a headache, but can also be just extremely illuminating on, you know, how this game operates. I think one of the biggest takeaways from this debug menu of Sly 3 is just seeing how the game works, what sort of variables are underneath the game, and what things the game cares about when you're playing it, you know, what sort of parameters it takes into mind, or what sort of options are there, how it limits the player and how it opens up the player to all of these possibilities. I think all of those are valuable things to know, and the fact that this debug menu lets you get an insight into what all of those things are, I think is extremely powerful, and it's probably one of the coolest things I've laid my eyes upon in a Sly Cooper game. And I've been playing these games since 2006, so it's really revitalized the Sly Cooper series for me, just having this debug menu and being able to explore the hell out of it and just really seeing what possibilities exist and what the game lets you do as it was in development. Because keep in mind, this game was built a month before its gold release was finalized, so there's still a lot of unfinished stuff in here, but there's also just so much stuff that was available that you could do through this debug menu that you just aren't able to do in the final game. So it's just a really cool insight, and I really wanted to just get this video out there and just show you guys, you know, if you're struggling with this debug menu or navigating through it, I hope this video at least helped you figure out what those functions may or may not have been. Otherwise, I just hope that you guys, you know, enjoyed this content and just seeing what makes Sly 3 Sly 3. And if you've made it this far, thank you so much. I honestly am very surprised because the tutorial portion of this video has been a little hit or miss for my standards, but definitely thank you for sticking around for this long. If you are interested in my other content consisting of this debug menu, I have a playlist in the description down below that you can watch. There's some wacky shenanigans going on in there that you may enjoy, so I highly recommend checking out that playlist. If you're more curious as to how this game compares to the final version of the game, both in terms of like story, cinematics, certain characters and cutscenes, etc., I have a full-on comparison series between this game and the final European release, and that is also in the description down below. I've gone through both games completely from start to finish as best as I could, because this particular build does have some difficulties with episodes 5 and 6, but I have compared all of the jobs between both of these builds, and I'll link that playlist in the description down below as well if you're interested. As always, if you guys want to see my newest videos, definitely follow me on Twitter. I post a lot of random stuff there, mostly Sly Cooper stuff, and that's you can find that on Twitter. I also have a Discord server, which you can join. It's fairly inactive, but I use it for mainly pushing out my tweets and videos, so if you want to be the latest, if you want to be the earliest to know of my uploads, they will definitely be in my Discord server, as well as on Twitter. And also, let me know what sort of findings you get with this debug menu. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or in my Discord server, and I'd be really curious to know what you guys find with this debug menu, because as I've mentioned before, and I will keep mentioning, there's just so many possibilities and outcomes, and you know, they all depend on what you've been doing up until that point. And with all that said, that'll bring me to the end of this video. As always, like it if you liked it, subscribe if you aren't already. I'll definitely have some more content pertaining to these prototype builds, and follow the wiki as well, the technical wiki. As I mentioned, it is open for both viewing and editing, so if you see any mistakes that crop up, or just want to add anything, please feel free to do so. Any contributions are welcome and very appreciated, so I definitely appreciate any sort of help that wiki gets. And of course, I'll be updating it as well as I go through these prototype builds of both Sly 3, Sly 2, and the first game as well, because there are some prototype builds there that are worth exploring. With all that said, I think I'm going to end the video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.